Hey everyone, Reed here with Big Strong Book, author of Chorus of 1,000, available now on Amazon. And today we are talking about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This is the first book published in the Chronicles of Narnia, the second book in chronological order. However, as I reread through Narnia, I'm rereading them in publication order, not chronological order. So this book is obviously a classic in fantasy literature, children's lit, just general English language books published in the 20th century. Uh, you know, I would be surprised if there's anybody watching this who has legitimately never heard of the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan, the Pevensey children, or we even if you may have not read it nor seen the film adaptation of it, you know of it at least. It's one of those kinds of stories that you just can't avoid. So the reason why I decided to reread this was just, as I've been reading more of Gene Wolfe, particularly with his Wizard Knight books and his, I guess, Catholic. It's interesting exploring like Catholic adjacent fantasy, which Wizard Knight is, even though it's not obviously a Catholic work. The Chronicles of Narnia is one that, there have been many groups who have criticized it for being I think the biggest criticisms or the biggest arguments against it are like it's a thinly veiled Christian allegory. You can understand where those arguments might have some merit, but at the end of the day, it's good children's fantasy. It's not overbearing, like an allegory would be. It doesn't beat you over the head with it, at least in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it doesn't. As a child, for reading the book and then seeing the movie when it was released, I, as a young kid, could recognize some of the similarities that may have been in Sunday school we talked about it, so that may have been where some of those things come about, that helped me as a kid see the similarities. But of course that was almost 20 years ago. The movie came out almost 20 years ago, and so it's my memory in terms of, if I realized the similarities, particularly with Aslan and Jesus, those similarities, I'm pretty sure I could recognize that without others, adults or whoever, telling me like, okay, these are the similarities, or if I figure that out on my own, it's because that was so long ago, I don't remember if I figured that out for myself or if that was just because somebody told me it. But if anybody comes to it from, even, you're a teenager, you're a young adult, older adult, whatever, and at least are fairly well versed in literature, as well as, stories from various religions, that the parallels are quite clear in that regard. But again, as I said, it's not, the allegories are there because you can just kind of be drawn to them. But then, why something like The Lord of the Rings? Granted, you could make the argument that The Lord of the Rings is better, more well-written, more substantive, because there's more going on than its Christian themes, which J.R.R. Tolkien admits are in there. He put them in there because he said, well, I'm a Catholic, and so it was obvious to him that it was a Catholic work. But The Lord of the Rings doesn't exactly get that level of criticism against it, but Narnia does. And yes, I will admit, Narnia, if you were to compare Narnia to Lord of the Rings head to head, in terms of prose style, world building, the the richness of the narrative, yes, Lord of the Rings head to head wins, I think, all of those fights against Narnia. But Narnia is great on its own. It's a work of wonder in a way that similar maybe in respect to The Hobbit. Lord of the Rings is not quite that. Lord of the Rings obviously being the more dense work. So maybe The Hobbit is a better or more apt comparison when it comes to comparing the Narnia books to it. Uh, but this, I mean, it so captures that. It captures the wonder of a child, the sense that anything is possible. That, and especially you have to look at it through the lens of who the protagonists, the Pevensey children, who they are, what they've been going through in their life, the kind of the childhood trauma that they are facing as being children, kind of growing up during the beginning of World War II, the Blitz and the air raids in London. So I'll kind of get into the plot here for those who aren't familiar thoroughly with it. But essentially, this book starts within our world, specifically in England during World War II. And the Pevensey children, there are four, two boys, two girls, and I think in order it's Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And like, I believe many children during World War II in England, whether they lived in like major metropolitan areas, I think their families sent them off to live or to grow up, at least during the war, in the country. I don't know how, if that was just for like they are in this book, they're on kind of their summer holiday, their summer vacation. So I don't know if it was just for those temporary breaks in schooling, or if that was more, once they went off into the country, they didn't really come back permanently until the end of the war. If there's anybody out there who knows that more in detail, I'm not sure if that was started as a military operation during World War II. If it had a name behind it, I'm sure it did. If anybody knows about that, and if it was really at least permanent until the end of the war, that then they could come back with their families. I'm sure they visited them, of course, many times. But if that was kids go out into the country and then they don't fully come back until they wouldn't come back until 1945 when the war ended. I don't know. But I think this takes place in 1940, if I'm not mistaken. And so the Pevensey children are kind of sent off in this in the country to live in the house of this professor, and they're exploring the house and they find these suits of armor, these great big books, and it's very much so the country retreat of a professor, the kind that you would imagine up in your mind, even that a child might imagine. It's all there. And they're children who like to explore. That's kind of their natural inclination. But of course, they're children kind of on their own, so they kind of have to keep each other in line. They have, in the absence of, clear parental figures in their life, and given the inherent trauma of the war, there's a lot of growing up that they have to do, that the children of this time, unfortunately, were forced to do. And so they start wandering around the house, and then Lucy, the youngest, finds a wardrobe, and she goes into the wardrobe, pushes past the fur coats, and then comes into this wintry forest scene. She sees a lamp post and then meets a faun named Mr. Tumnus. And that kind of kicks off everything. Of course, she spends some time with Mr. Tumnus and learns of this from Mr. Tumnus's perspective, this kind of evil character known as the White Witch, who has kind of cast the lands of Narnia into a permanent winter, which a lot of characters say were winter without ever getting to Christmas. and she, heads back into the wardrobe, thinking that, she's been gone for hours and hours. But in fact, when she returns to the professor's country home, absolutely no time has passed at all, or maybe, less than a minute has passed. Um, so, but then, of course, then she tells her siblings, and they all go back to investigate and then find nothing in there. There's nothing in the wardrobe. There's not. They look behind it, they think she just, oh, she's young. She just kind of made it up, and it's part of just her imagination. But then later on, Lucy goes back when they're playing hide and seek, and her brother Edmund, who, he's set up to kind of be the spurned middle child. He wants to kind of be on his own. He's at that age where, he feels like he wants responsibility. He wants to be seen, to be heard, but then he feels like he's just being treated like a little kid, but he doesn't want to. And so that creates some, anger, a little bit of resentment, jealousy, whatever that might be. But he follows Lucy through into Narnia. However, he gets picked up by Jadis, the White Witch, and we learn that the Lucy and Susan are referred to as daughters of Eve. Peter and Edmund are referred to as sons of Adam. So, and that prophecies state that when two daughters of Eve and two sons of Adam will return, and that Narnia will kind of return, that the winter will go away, the springtime will come, and they'll save the land and cast down the White Witch. But Edmund kind of falls under the influence of the White Witch, and she tells him that she'll make him a prince and he can kind of do whatever he wants. And of course, for Edmund, who is the spurned younger brother, that's very appealing to him. And then eventually, all four of the Pevensey children make their way into Narnia, and off we go then on this big adventure. Now, I say big adventure. It seemed bigger when I was a kid. At least the length of the book, the length of the story. This very slim mass market paperback is only about 200 pages. I used to have an old movie tie-in edition omnibus of the whole series that's tattered and falling apart. Now I think it's less than 100 pages. It's maybe just 90 pages in that. So it's very short. But when I was a kid, I was like, oh, I thought it was a super long story. It's actually not. And so the kids, they kind of get set off on this grand journey as they kind of go through, and they start to see that spring is coming back. The White Witch's influence is starting to wane a little, and that things are unfolding, and they meet creatures. They meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. They meet Father Christmas or Santa Claus, and again, off we go from there. So the images that stick in my mind most, of course, are because I can remember clearly, and I'm sure many who are watching this can, whether you were teenagers or children, as I was, when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out in 2005. I'm fairly confident I went to see it in theaters. I hadn't read the book before, but I loved it. It's such a great, because of course that was getting into Harry Potter and all of that, and that was before I had gotten into Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, when the movies came out, I was definitely too young to have seen them, or even if I had seen them, to have appreciated them. But I was of the right age where Harry Potter and then this came along, and it was great to have kind of another big fantasy story to really get invested in. And what in regarding the adaptation, a lot of it too, I think the adaptation is a really great, really well made. It's been a little while since I've seen it, but it definitely expands more of the action sequences that are relatively lacking in this. Lewis has a tendency, he'll skip over battles, or he'll really simplify it to maybe a 1 or 2 pages, so not that much, but because it's almost like he's writing this to. I get that I think he wrote this for his goddaughter, but it reads as like literally a bedtime story you could tell to children over the course of like a few nights. It really is kind of that, which is good. But again, that it makes it clear it's a story for children, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's still interesting to observe it from the perspective of an adult now coming to this, having many more books in general under my belt, to see if that really how quick this was, how fast the story was. And but then I think I had to go back and remind myself what this was like to read it as a child. Now, I understand that you don't want to observe everything like this through kind of the nostalgia tinted glasses of, oh, I remember this when I was a kid, and then you revisit it as an adult and it's a different experience to what you remember. The same could be said for this, but I think this really helps to really place yourself back into, if you read this as a child, or even if you didn't, to kind of play and place yourselves in the perspective of the Pevensey children. I think that really helps. But yeah, this is, it's a fun little story. And going forward, I can't wait to dive into the other Narnia books, because I do not have great memory of pretty much any of those. I know I've read all of them, but again, it's been well over 15 years, I think, since I've read the books. And this was the only one that I ever remembered clearly. I think because probably helped by the fact that I saw the movie many times as a kid, so that helped the story kind of stick in my mind. But yeah, it's Portal. It's a staple of Portal fantasy, if you like that. But then I'll talk a little bit here about kind of more spoilery stuff, so you've been warned. Uh, Obviously, the stuff with Aslan. Again, yes, you could point to similarities if it's an allegory for him representing Christ, or offers to be sacrificed when he doesn't have to, uh, and then he is miraculously resurrected, and then ends up kind of saving the day and taking down the witch. But one thing that has always stuck from the ending for me is when the Pevensey children become the kings and queens of Narnia, and I forget the name of the place off the top of my head. I'll kind of skip forward here, but yeah, Cair Paravel, this like the castle on the hill by the sea, and they become the kings and queens of Narnia, and they kind of live into their adulthood a little bit, and then they're hunting this fabled stag through the woods at the end, and they come across the lamppost, and they don't really remember it, but then they find themselves ultimately then going back through the wardrobe, and then when they come out, they're kids again. And I think when I was a kid, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird, that kind of sucks. But then the older you get, you're like, really, like, would they retain that, whether the wisdom or the knowledge that they learned over the course of many years, would they retain that? How would they look over that again? And it's equal parts, I think, kind of a little depressing, but then a little it's hard to fathom. You go from being an adult to being a kid again. Maybe that's a blessing in disguise, maybe it's not, but yeah, it's just a interesting food for thought for the ending. So yeah, again, it was great to revisit, even though it was much quicker than I remember it being. And I can see where, if you're kind of going into this expecting something like its esteemed peers, you're going to be disappointed. But it's a fun little story, and I'm looking forward to just diving back into the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia as well. So, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Have you read it? Let me know what you think. And as always, I will see you guys next time.